Thank you, Michelle, for that very generous, kind introduction. And in all honesty, what a remarkable conference this has been. Been a phenomenal 2 days. The collegiality, the critical thinking, the setting, and to Michelle and Lo and others and all the grad students, thank you very much for doing this. It's really been a remarkable. I wanted to start with a bit of an overview of the conference itself, and that is that as you look through the program or having attended the sessions, there are obviously some constellations of concerns in terms of critical criminology. So we've talked about obviously the carceral state, the growth of criminality, the mass incarceration, policing, both in its inherently problematic forms and its more overtly problematic forms in terms of profiling and discriminatory policing, violence against women, domestic violence. Travis and others have talked about black ops and black sites and places where people are kept without legal or civil rights out of public view. Other papers have been on banishment orders, discrimination against the homeless, these sorts of issues. I'd like to take one new direction, or at least suggest a new direction, by making an argument that we are seeing this at such a pervasive level now, both in the United States and globally, as part of the neoliberal project, as part of the carceral state. But I think it's not overly dramatic to say that we're seeing really a systematic a system of social death. That what we're looking at now is in many ways the withdrawal of the lifeblood of citizenship for more and more people. As a sociologist, where this is the first day of intro to sociology, we talked about social life and how social life rests on the ability to interact freely, to construct meaning together in fairly equal terms. So in that sense, social death, I think, has a very particular meaning, which again is to deny the possibility of mutuality, of collegiality, of graciousness, of mutual support, and also to take people out of the possibility of co-presence with others, to remove them culturally, physically, spatially from the possibilities of building a world together. So in that sense, I think, sadly, tragically, one thing that links many of the topics that we do research on and care about is, again, what I would begin to argue merits the term social death. Again, the idea of denying people the lifeblood, the breathing room it takes to be a member of society, removing them from the possibility of social discourse and social interaction. And if we add the examples we just looked at, also, this is research that some of you know that I've been doing, if we look also at migrants fleeing across the across the Mediterranean from around Africa, if you look at Syrian immigrants trying to get past barbed wire fences and guard gates into Europe, if we look at Central Americans and Mexicans who are coming on freight trains to North America, we see in a sense, I think, a world that is awash with people who have lost the ability to engage fully in social life, who have, again, been made to experience a kind of death in order to go on with their lives. Now, another aspect I would like to add to this is, of course, that it's not just social death, it's cultural death. And so here, again, sort of the cultural chronological take on this. If we think back to Stan Cohen and Jock Young's classic notions of folk devils and moral panic, if we think about the work that many of you have done in terms of media depictions of marginalized groups, of stereotypes, and often very vulgar, harmful stereotypes that are promoted through media coverage, through political discourse, I think we also see a kind of cultural death. That is a quieting of alternative narratives, a silence enforced on people so that they don't matter symbolically. They're not part of the cultural world that we create for ourselves as well. So I think social death, cultural death go hand in hand to, again, I'm using dramatic terminology on purpose, to all but exterminate then for millions and millions of people the possibility of membership in the world that we hope to share and create for each other. Now again, that very much merits the attention of critical criminology, and of course, knowing most people in this room, that is, I think, what many of us have spent years doing, and what younger scholars are beginning to do, is to look at the circumstances by which that is justified, by which the machinery of that is put into place, and by which we, again, exclude from social and cultural life more and more people. Certainly Jock Young's work on the exclusionary society would be a way we can think about that as well. So that very much merits our ongoing research. That's an old direction, I think, in critical criminology on which we need to continue. But a new direction I would like to suggest is that, of course, when people are murdered socially, when they suffer cultural death, they don't actually die physically, at least not right away. They often do quick soon enough. But really what we're talking about here often is, of course, that you continue to exist in society, but with the terms of human engagement withdrawn from you. And so the term I'd like to suggest is that in that sense, I think millions and millions of people now are living as ghosts. That is, they are living a kind of afterlife after their murder through the forces of oppression, injustice, economic disenfranchisement, etc. So I use the word ghost in a fairly technical sense, not sort of humorously certainly, but also not as a loose metaphor. But having, over the last few months, read some ghost theory and read some narrative analysis of what ghosts suggest to us and anthropological analysis and the way in which literary writers use the term, it actually has some very interesting meanings. Of course, the first one is that to be ghost-like or to be spectral is to never quite be in the frame, right? Is to flicker and haunt and be at the edge of consciousness. So one thing that makes something ghost-like or spectral is that, again, it's difficult to focus directly on it because the ghost-like apparition flits in and out of our vision. It's always the corner of our eye out there we see a ghost, not head on. And so again, this idea of flickering, moving, fleeting encounters with ghosts certainly is part of what it means for something to be ghostly. But another aspect of ghostliness, or being a ghost, is that you are both there and not there. That ghosts are often defined by the fact that they are in some ways in the moment, but some ways from the past, or suggest some alternative world, therefore we can move forward if we wanted to. The supernatural, the idea of parallel universes, the sort of there and not there dialectic that a ghost-like encounter forces on us. But the real heart of the meaning to me is that ghosts are often talked about as the presence of absence. That when someone dies, when we suffer a great loss, in a sense to talk about ghosts is a way to talk about the fact that although the person is gone, that part of our life is over, the situation is now past, it lingers, its absence becomes as real as its presence once was. And so again, I've become fascinated with this notion of, again, the presence of absence. That absence is not simply a void, absence itself becomes a kind of social and cultural phenomenon that creates a new way of living in the absence of what once was there. So in that sense, it seems to me that one new direction I want to suggest is that while we do critical analysis, critical legal scholarship, the political economy of the circumstances that lead to social and cultural death, we also need to rethink what it would mean to understand ghosts. Where we would go to find ghosts, how we would think about them, how we'd see them, how we would understand what it means to live in a ghostly afterlife after being condemned to death socially or culturally. And the first thing that I would like to discuss about that is that I've been working through the idea of how we then study absence. What does it mean to excavate the reality of absence? And a first aspect to me is to make a distinction, not a hard and fast one, but a distinction between being not there and being no longer there. So let me start with not there. It seems to me that as sociologists and criminologists, fired by the sociological and criminological imagination, one of the key aspects of that would be to be able to see what is not present. To have the critical faculties and to have the sociological imagination to imagine those who are simply not in the frame. So for example, as we enjoy downtown Knoxville or downtown Dallas or New York City, to be aware that of course we're partly enjoying it on the terms of the developers who have now excluded homeless populations, the poor, and others from those spaces. So while there is pleasure to be had there, there's also the presence of the absence of those who have been now marginalized and excluded. And as we watch on television street protest or conflict from around the world, to notice that often those are not crowds of people, those are crowds of men. Because given the gender relations globally, often women are not, in a sense, allowed to be in that kind of public position. And so not to simply say, well, that was a protest by the people of that country, but rather, what were the gender politics, what were the ethnic politics, who was not in the frame of the coverage of that, who was not out in our streets protesting or resisting authority. So in that sense, the existence of not being there, to me, is a profoundly observable phenomenon if we learn to think in a sort of counterintuitive way, if we learn to look for what we can't see, and to have the imagination and the cultural and historical critical memory to understand who is not allowed to be part of the things that we think we're studying or trying to understand. Similarly, I would say then, no longer there is another category of how we can understand absence. And this one to me, if you know some of my research, is a very powerful one, which is that we are not only required then to have the sociological imagination, we're also required to have our own memory, to preserve and craft a critical cultural memory of how changes then also create social death. And so, for example, all those that are, as we've talked about for 2 days, all those that are no longer in communities because they've been imprisoned, because they've been caught in police traps, and have been removed from neighborhoods. So that we don't only try to understand a neighborhood, we understand those who are no longer in that neighborhood and the terms under which they've been drawn from that neighborhood into the carceral state. Speaking of migration, right, as we now know, there are large areas in Italy and Greece, certainly villages in Mexico, that are all but devoid of young men because they've all migrated elsewhere to send money back to that village. So the village is not only defined by who's there, it's defined by who's no longer there because of the circumstances of global inequality and poverty and impoverization. An example that matters greatly to me, again, if you know some of my work, is the way in which what's called consumer-driven urban development remakes cities in such that they are meant to hide what they have now obliterated. So we were meant to mistake the faux historical building for the actual historical building it replaces. We're meant to forget that the single room occupancy home or the low-cost housing that's now been bulldozed or replaced by expensive shops and million-dollar condos is still, its absence is still a presence because it's actually not gone, it's no longer there. And those are two different things. The political economy in that sense of what's no longer there often reveals to us the nature of the inequality and injustice. An example, some research I'm doing right now, as some of you know, with train hoppers and gutter punks and people who live in and around freight trains. In the town where I now live in Fort Worth, there was recently a new freeway built, actually a toll road, again, neoliberal logics of generating money. And the toll road was built over, arguably, the city fathers argued, empty land, useless land that paralleled the railroad yards. Of course, if you knew that land, which we're meant not to know, you knew those were actually long-standing hobo camps, that people have been living in those shrubs and under those trees for decades, and it handed down the knowledge of how to live in those yards to generations of hobos, train hoppers, and gutter punks. So to see that freeway, personally infuriating. Beyond that, we can offer an ecological critique of the insanity of building more car-driven transportation. We can talk about urban sprawl and the way in which city policies are often designed to benefit those in the suburbs who are asked to come back to the city to consume. All that's certainly important. We also need to remember what's no longer there and to keep not only that memory alive, but to keep alive our ability to investigate and excavate what's no longer there. Now, a third aspect to me of excavating absence is the notion of ruins. And here I would suggest that often neoliberalism, like capitalism, generates ruins. And by ruins I mean not just physical decay, we also mean jobs that have moved elsewhere, industries that are now closed down, housing estates that are no longer offer police services in Detroit or elsewhere, right? So that from a sociological viewpoint, ruins certainly are physical, but ruins are also in some ways the absence of what was once provided, the absence of the economic motors that once drove cities, and this sort of thing. And of course, if you think about it, the ghost of inequality generally occupy ruins, right? That is, they occupy worlds that have been left to them because they are no longer seen as valuable. And this can be an inner city neighborhood, it can be an abandoned housing estate, it can be a closed-up factory or an abandoned warehouse district. People generally live in the ruins that are the product of the same, that are from the same forces that led to their death in the first place. And in that sense, by the way, I would also draw on, to me, a deeply inspirational book, Dorothea Lange and Paul Taylor's 1939 book on the Great Depression called American Exodus, where Dorothea Lange, a great documentary photographer, went out with Paul Taylor, a leftist social scientist, and her husband, Laura Lover at the time, and they tried to document what it meant to be cast adrift by the forces of the Great Depression. And their breakthrough was to, first of all, to combine text with photography in a very innovative way. But secondly, they came up with the idea of erosion. And their notion was that the land was eroded in the same way that the people were eroded. That is, people were ruined by injustice as much as the circumstances in which they lived. So this is a phenomenal book because Dorothea Lange photographs fields that have been left to the Dust Bowl. She photographs farms that are now decaying and rusting, but she also photographs the people who are now decaying and disabled and left to ruin by the forces of the Great Depression. So it seems to me that whether we're talking about drug use, whether we're talking about sexual exploitation, all the issues that concern us as criminologists, part of what we're looking at then is the way in which people are ruined and the way in which that ruination is both spatial but also personal, embodied, and cultural at the same time. So it seems to me that requires, I'll say it this way, that has certainly required me to rethink what it means to observe. I'm an ethnographer by training. I think I know how to observe things, but I realize that most of what I've been trained to observe is what's in front of me, not to learn how to observe what's not there or no longer there or hidden from me through the forces of ruination. Now, a second aspect of this, to me, a second broad aspect, is the idea of interstitiality. And we really don't need any more multisyllabic academic terms, so let me just say, by that, of course, meaning in between, right? So to be interstitial is to occupy the in-between spaces. And it strikes me in the research I've been doing over the last couple of years that another thing that defines those who have suffered social and cultural death is that they are left to live interstitially. That is, they almost entirely occupy the in-between, not the one or the other. And so if you think about the economy, right, we have thousands or millions of young workers who don't so much have one job or another as much as they spend their lives going between jobs, piecing together part-time work, hurrying back to the daycare center, trying to hope the bus doesn't break down to get to their third job before they can quickly get some sleep and then head back to the daycare center with their children. And so in that sense, their lives are lived in between the economy. Their lives are lived in the margins of the economic order, not so much in one job, one career, or another. And of course then, back to Stuart Mill's, what might seem like a personal failing, like you've now been between jobs for a month, or I notice this is your third career move in a year, is actually, of course, a social problem. It is that you are forced to live between the spaces you once occupied. And so also, if we think about the relationships, right, the durability of relationships, those who are left to the ruins, those who have been culturally and socially caused to suffer social and cultural death, are often also, they are also living in circumstances where stable relationships are difficult. So rather than, again, sort of psychologizing that, or certainly rather than blaming the victim, we can think about how circumstances force people who are excluded and marginalized into a kind of tenuous movement between relationships, as opposed to, in some ways, the privilege of stable, solid relationships. And again, if we think about the work that's being done now on migrants and refugees, you, I suspect, know what I'm about to say, they, of course, are all but unable to settle. Right? The legal and social terms of settlement are almost never offered. And so, as you know, right, we have then encampments in Calais trying to cross the, go under the Channel to England. We have refugees that are moved back and forth across the French and Italian borders because they're constantly illegal. So therefore, every time they land a new space, they're exiled to the other space where they're also illegal. Right? And so in that sense, they have no choice but to live between countries, between identities, between encampments, move between refugee camps, etc. Now, another aspect of interstitiality that has come to me in thinking about this is the idea of time. And I begin to realize that in some ways, waiting is also interstitiality. That the act of waiting is to be caught between one event and another, to be caught in out of time and between time. And in my research on drifters, which often is very exciting because you're on the move or you're hopping a freight train, really mostly what you do is wait. Because since you have no control over the temporal arrangements of your own life, you wait at the welfare office, you wait for your probation officer to call you back, you wait to catch a train over which you have no control, you wait for your court date. That actually much of being adrift, seemingly counterintuitively, is not actually drift as movement, but being adrift from the ability to control your own time. So it seems to me then that we see more and more people in the brilliant film we just saw, a phenomenal film, people waiting, right? They're missed 2 days of work because they're waiting to pay a ticket that they shouldn't have been given in the first place. They have systematically been denied not only social life, but the social prerequisites for controlling and managing one's own time. And of course, with flex scheduling and split shifts, a new kind of on-demand economy, once again, people who are always caught between time, who live between places, between jobs, between relationships, between temporal coordinates as well. So once again, it's forced me to think about my sense of time and how privileged my sense of time is. I may often feel hurried. I may be worrying about catching a plane, as we we're just talking about. What I'm often privileged to do is not have to actually lose complete control of my time and be left in these sort of liminal interstitial temporal spaces. That to me is part of how you die socially and culturally as well. Now, another aspect of this I'd like to point out too is the idea that, is that much of this also has to do then with a lack of control over the circumstances of your life as a whole. So interstitiality then also begins to suggest not only between, but beneath and behind. So it also strikes me that those who have suffered social death are often left to occupy what Goffman might call the backstages of social life, but rather than a toggling between backstage and front stage, they are left to the backstage all but permanently. So refugee camps that are out of sight, trash pickers who know to skulk the alleys after dark lest they be apprehended, homeless camps behind a rise in the freeway, this sort of thing. And so again, not only out of sight and not only interstitial, but behind social arrangements or underlying in the framework beneath the new economy, beneath the circumstances of our lives. And so, by the way, to be self-critical on all of our behalf, if we think then about how a hotel works, right, with often minimum wage labor and migrant workers. Then, of course, those who service us at a hotel are, in fact, instructed on how to stay out of sight. The undercarriage of hotel living is not meant to be seen because they're always behind the stages, beneath, flickering in and out of our rooms, asking if we'd like more water, more coffee. The prerequisites of a conference or of a university relies increasingly on part-time work, part-time employees, and those who, again, are trained and required to stay beneath the surface, behind the scenes, between one event and another. So here, by the way, I again would suggest what I've learned from photographers, because in fact, some of the great documentary photographers like Frank and others made their name on thinking about how to photograph not what was happening, but the times between what was happening. Robert Frank famously said he looked for moments of disequilibrium. He looked for the moments between actual events. Right? So you're about to go somewhere. You're on your way from one place to another. You're lost in a moment of confusion between your previous decision and your next one. For Frank, those are the moments in which social life came alive and that revealed to us then the sort of, again, disequilibrium that haunts the equilibrium of society. And I'll mispronounce his name, but Robert Leterre, who was a New York City street photographer, never shot a building head on. He shot the moments when a pedestrian is hurrying to cross the street as the light is changing. He shot the shadows between two skyscrapers and the way in which vendors might go in those shadows on a hot day, or someone might ease down the alley to take a piss, right? He shot the in-between spaces on the argument that, again, it's an interesting kind of positivist Western notion that all that matters is what's in the frame. What often matters is what's on the edge of the frame, what's happening between the action, not the action itself. So this also I found deeply troubling as an ethnographer. That is, my training was look at what's happening and record it. But maybe the real action is always just out of our vision. Maybe we have to think about not interviewing people, but interviewing people before and after an event. Not asking them about what happened, but asking them what led to or followed from that. Maybe going into subcultures, so we've been talking about, not as unified wholes, but subcultures as amorphous, shifting spaces that are often their most alive when they don't seem to actually be stable and functioning in a unified way. So it seems to me then, without getting too deeply philosophical about all this requires a whole new way of thinking about the world, right? Now we're not talking about positivism in terms of surveys or statistics. We're talking about the very notion, a very ontological, epistemic notion of what it means to know the social world and what it means to live in that world. And again, I think part of our privilege is that many of us have had the privilege of living lives in the moment, not waiting, not lost, not between much at all, actually. Some of it enforced on ourselves by our own mistakes. But the privilege that comes with our lives is to make the mistake to think that's how everyone lives, to look for our own lives and the lives of others. I think more and more millions of people have to be thought of interstitially, in terms of absence, in terms of in-between spaces, in between lives, and this is not false humility. I'm trying to think how to do that. I'm trying to retrain myself as an ethnographer of the present moment, as opposed to an ethnographer of perhaps more stable or unified times. So, real kind of time to think. Yeah. So, a couple of then other new directions, this seems to me. One is that perhaps one thing that critical criminology might think of itself as doing is telling critical ghost stories. That is, stories that are in fact haunting, that do in fact cause discomfort, that do make us shiver a bit before we go to sleep at night, precisely because they account for both the political economy of the present moment, but also for the lives of those who have been lost within that moment and have suffered social and cultural death. So it seems to me one powerful way we might think about narrative criminology, or about visual work, or about the kind of work, cultural criminology that many of us do, is to think how to decenter our own work, to create work that is haunting, uncertain, troubling in ways that are not only not conventional social science, but maybe not even conventional narrative. Maybe narratives that without plot lines. Maybe photos that are out of focus. Maybe studies not of groups, but of how groups come together. Maybe studies not of a neighborhood, but of the transitions the neighborhood is going through. I think we perhaps need to rethink what it is we're studying. But two more new directions that I think, by the way, more death, but then a bit of life. Two more ways in which I think we have to rethink our role in all of this, and that is, of course, that we are also increasingly ghosts. Despite what privileges we may have, as a profession, academia is, of course, being murdered as well. 3/4 of all faculty in the United States are now part-time temporary hires. Tenure is under attack wherever we look. Public universities, private universities under attack. Of course we occupy positions of phenomenal privilege, but as a collective enterprise, there is no doubt, I'm sorry to say to the younger scholars in the room, that the political economy of education is going to follow and is following the political economy of the rest of the neoliberal late capitalist world, which is toward, again, less certainty, less career stability, more movement between jobs, between departments, between career choices, and rather than that being a mistake or an aberration, perhaps becoming the way of life for more and more of us. Now, that's both a tragedy, it certainly is, and demands critique and resistance, but it also creates an opportunity. It seems to me that creates the possibility that the generation coming, more than our generation, can actually achieve a kind of verstehen, can achieve a kind of lived understanding with these people that we are setting out to study, precisely because we share some of the same tragedies and injustices that they do. So as always, right, resistance is not saying hell no, oh that's fine too. Resistance is thinking of ways to turning one's own oppression into strength, a way of turning power back on itself. It seems to me if we're going to be increasingly made to be part-time flex workers in the neoliberal university, then we can also use that as a kind of methodological advantage to perhaps understand the lives of those we're trying to understand. Perhaps the less stable we are, the more we can understand the instability of others. But another direction, it seems to me, is that will also require then the death of method as we now know it. And I want to speak just for a second about this. Ethnography, which as you know I'm an advocate and devotee of, ethnography has often been posited as the sort of loyal opposition to positivism. So on the one hand, surveys, statistical analysis, on the other hand, ethnography. Certainly true. If you know the history of our disciplines, that battle has been fought now for decades. But to the extent that ethnography was seen as telling the whole story of a stable situation, right? Here's the ethnography of this neighborhood, here's the ethnography of this gang, here's the ethnography of this graffiti crew. Perhaps even ethnography has to be questioned as, again, a kind of totalizing inquiry. Perhaps we have to decenter our own methods as well. So not only will the slab-like turgid methodologies of surveys and statistics not be of much use in this world, I'm not even sure the traditional approaches to ethnography will be of much use. So as I wrap up here in a minute, it's a genuine question. What do we do if we're trying to align ourselves and train ourselves to study a world that's increasingly occupied not by people, but by ghosts? That is as much about social death as social life. So it seems to me we are both tragically, but also very positively positioned to think of new ways to deal with this world. Now I'll wrap up with two final thoughts. The first of these is that I'm struck by the etymological similarity between the words resurrection and insurrection. Resurrection, of course, means to raise up or to rise up again, to bring back from the dead. Insurrection being to an uprising. So it seems to me that one way we can be active as scholars and be engaged with this world we're now thinking of is to think, in a sense, excuse the vaguely religious terminology, but how can we play a role in resurrecting the dead, in bringing them back from social and cultural death, in learning the lives of ghosts enough to organize them and ourselves into a kind of insurrection against the circumstances that led to this. I don't think traditional forms of organizing may work. I'm not sure traditional forms of affiliation, perhaps a little more flexible, more fluid, perhaps want to think of new ways of being in the world ourselves. But it seems to me the resurrection of the dead can also be the insurrection of the ghost. So this is one thing I think perhaps some of the new social movements can teach us. But I'll close with the great rabble-rousing, courageous troublemaker Mother Jones, who also was, of course, one of the founding members of the IWW, itself a response to changing circumstances at the time in a form of resistance. And her famous rallying cry, of course, Mother Jones said, "Pray for the dead, but fight like hell for the living." It seems to me now we may need to fight like hell for the dead as well. Thank you.
I like the idea of paradigm shift, totally resurrection and evolution. One thing that is not clear for me is that social days, if we accept social days, don't you think we might take agency from people?
Yes, I would say actually the definition of social death for me would actually be withdrawal of agency. That is that not rather than accepting, I think we need to fight it, but what often happens in people's lives, I think, is they, in more and more areas of their lives, they lose agency, right? They lose the ability to live as agents of their own destiny. So I think I would agree with you that social death to me is, in a sense, the systematic, unjust withdrawal of human agency. So now you're a data point, you're a probationer, you're in prison, you're waiting in line to pay your fines, you're begging for work, that sort of thing.
In relation to prison imprisonment, that is true. Yeah. But in relation to poverty, in relation to migration, in relation to uprooting of people?
Yeah.
How do you see that?
Oh, I see. Oh, well, very good point. Yeah, by ghost, I certainly do not mean that you have lost all agency, but rather that you're forced to exercise agency in ways against those that denied you. So you form a refugee camp out of cardboard and leftover wood behind a tree hill so that no one can see it. So you're forced to, and that's, you're certainly still making decisions. You're also resisting, perhaps. You learn to ride the freight train that's meant to haul corn and beans. Instead, you ride on top of it to get through Mexico to find a job in South Texas. So you're certainly still engaged in active work, but you're forced to live in a sort of afterlife that comes with after the loss of your job, 20 years in prison, expulsion from the country, that sort of thing. So that's a very good point. Very good point. Thank you. I didn't mean to suggest that ghosts have no volition, but rather that they're forced to work through how to live in ways that many of the rest of us are not forced to encounter.
Yes, as a follow-up to that. I like this idea of ghosts, and I think I like it in part because of what it evoked for me. So one thing that came to mind was some of the work that Travis has done with respect to zombies, Shimon Membe's idea of necropower,
Right.
some of your earlier work on speed people's names and memorials,
Right.
and I guess also speaking to Nikki Rafter's work on that as well.
Right.
But in terms of telling critical ghost stories, I wonder if there's a way to encourage haunting on the part of the people who have become ghosts. Is
Yeah.
that something that is a possibility?
Yeah. Actually, I think this will maybe partly answer that. One thing I've gone back and dug up, as some of my earlier training, is that one thing the Wobblies mastered, the IDW, was if you're going to reduce us to an itinerant, fully paid workforce, and if you have the power to kick us off the farm or off the cherry orchard at will, what you've done now is create a vast mobile army of pissed off proletarians. And so when they had their free speech fights, they put out the call, hop the freights, and come. Well, why could everybody come? Because they had no stable employment. So then they could flood the town and actually win the battle. So in that sense, they could haunt, the zombie army could arrive precisely because they've been made into that kind of worker. So I think that's a great point. Maybe, if you don't mind, how can we work with people who've been made into ghosts to more aggressively haunt those who have done this to us? Yeah, that's a wonderful idea. And I think, I don't know, this really is, I'm just trying to think this through. I think if you learn how to look for it, you find that that is happening, right? The temp workers aren't just passive recipients of a bad economy. They're engineering ways to network or trade off child care or well, in some of the European examples, shoplift from the corporation that just fired you, So that's a great idea. If we're going to think in this metaphor, perhaps a little bit, then what would haunting mean as a more political act, as opposed to sort of just haunting the edges of social life?
I think connecting on that, you could do ghost tours where you take them to those people to those in-between spaces and see how individuals are living.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think only as an active engagement, right? Not ruin porn, but
Yes.
ruin engagement.
Thank you so much, Jeff. There was a lot to think about, a lot of provocative stuff. I really like this absent presence and trying to pay attention to the interstitiality. Like, it seems like you're calling for a politics of the excluded, like paying attention to the excluded, both empirically but also theoretically and methodologically.
Yeah.
So I guess my question, or half question, half comment, is I think that's really important in thinking about people who are social deaf, people who are in liminal positions, this sort of what we call the suffering subject that a lot of us are interested in. But how to bring that same sensibility to studying regimes of power, right? Of paying attention to how oftentimes, well, nobody made that decision, it just seemed like the right way to govern parole, or the right law to pass, or the right way, like how to bring that same sensibility that like, that we should cut the head off the king,
Right, absolutely.
Like, and see powers flowing laterally all over the place, but like bringing that interstitial sensibility and the care for the excluded to actually studying regimes of power as well.
Again, I don't know. One thing I think I've begun to understand is that if we use old, like early Marxist models of capital, for example, we're probably not going to catch the fact that a lot of the supply chain management, on-time delivery, flex scheduling, right? So in that sense, it's a kind of a haunted economic system too, in the sense that it doesn't hold still and hold together in a focused way like it once did. It may be more networks and flows of capital and power. And so in that sense, you're right. Maybe we could bring the same to me it's almost an epistemic. I'm really trying to think, how do I know things now? And so maybe we have to rethink how we know power as well as how we know the consequences of power. Hang on just a second, Mark.
Oh, sorry, Mark. Actually, I wanted to continue on to a lot of this, and I was thinking back to Phantasmagoria,
You know, we have Walter Benjamin, and of course Steve Pyle, who had Real Cities, and he's talking about this. And one thing that I always, had a bone to pick with Steve Pyle is when he talked about these developed cities and how we're supposed to feel, and that emotion and that imagination. It was always from a very positive sense, like, look how beautiful this
Right.
is. But ultimately, it could be a place of horrors. You look at it, you think this is just absolutely terrifying in many ways.
Right.
And then in terms of very modern application, I look at a lot of the gentrifications of cities.
Yeah.
So in Tampa, they recently have taken a lot of these inner city neighborhoods, had generations of individuals live, how they planned the schools, how they planned their entire social lives were based on that geographic location.
Yeah.
And then they're ported out. And so they come back to this space that has been redeveloped.
Right.
And it's very haunting because they have the psychogeography
Right,
that, they're
exactly.
still seeing something that was once there, which goes back to crime tourism,
Yeah.
when people are kind of looking at this parking lane and
Yeah.
very grim because body was found there, but
Yeah.
it is what it
Right
is.
point,
I mean, and
yeah.
so it seems like there is this sort of need to really invite back maybe things that we have once had in our literature,
Right.
but maybe we've forgotten.
I agree. And I don't know if it's true, but I've learned more reading like novelists and literary theorists. So once again, where do we need to go to bring back in or define the tools that help us think about the world in this way? And by the way, one tool I've found, I can't remember the author, but a book called Arrival City, arguing that these giant urban enclaves, we think of urbanization as rural is now going urban. He's arguing that really a lot of these are arrival cities because you arrive, you lose hold there, you go back to the village, this time you bring your uncle back, now you can't make it or you get arrested, you go back and live with your kids for a while. And so it's more, again, a kind of interstitial life between rural and urban. So at the edges of the great rural cities, the Van Leeuwen in Paris or the outskirts of Ulaanbaatar is one study, are actually they're not cities. They're interstitial spaces that are constantly in flux. And as you say, in that sense, whether we're talking about gentrification of inner city or we're talking about the growth of a city outward, maybe we have to think of it less as a space than as a sort of unsteady, haunting process.
Right.
I got to add too that the Paris Commune, right, was not just an uprising of anarchists and others. It was also against Haussmann's re-spatialization of Paris, where he drove the boheme out, and they came back and haunted their own spaces from which they were excluded. So we might also think historically when this is happening as well.
I was just going to practical aspects of that. Two of the Paris suicide bombers were hidden within the Syrian refugees.
Yeah.
And now we're left with their ghosts.
Right.
And so I think that what you have to say has a lot of practical value.
That's an interesting point. Their ghosts haunt every discussion now or every checkpoint in Europe. As Syrian
Every
refugees.
intelligence discussion going on in Europe right now
Yeah.
to figure this out has some resonance with what you say.
Yeah. And again, so it requires a whole new way, right? This is not only is this not traditional positivism, I'm not even sure it's traditional research. Because you can imagine people hearing us talk this way, like, you lost your mind. But maybe we have, or maybe we're glimpsing the uncanny.
Well, it certainly isn't a conventional intelligence work.
Right. Yes.
Thank you. Just a quick question before I ask it. Are you reading Avery Gordon, the Ghostly Matters?
I think I read that. I can't remember. I know the text you're talking about. I may have read part of
Okay.
it.
So I guess I'm thinking about a few texts that, for me, are foundational in thinking about haunting, social death, and absent presences. And I want to just reinsert them in the conversation because they are actually, I think, haunting this conversation. And I think it's no accident that they are women and based on women of color theorizing. That Toni Morrison's understanding of the way that blackness figures as an absent presence in American literature is a perfect example of the kind of haunting that you're talking about and that I think Avery Gordon writes about in Ghostly Matters. And it's fascinating. So she's a sociologist. So all of y'all have not read her, then it's really a disciplinary problem because her kind of sociology is so profoundly imaginative and important, and yet it's disavowed by sociologists because of its liminality and its highly politicized interventions and its explicit relationship to women of color theorizing. And Lisa Marie Cacho's super recent Social Death which is a citation of Orlando Patterson, but of course taking it in a totally new direction, I think should give us a lot of pause in thinking about what social death can accomplish politically, because the thing that she's so brilliant in diagnosing is how social death is so easily recuperated by elites by placing people into ideological grooves that essentially pit them against each other.
Right.
So the ways in which people who suffer social death are invited to participate in the ostracization of others. And I think when I was listening to James Kilgore this morning, I was thinking about the potential in social death, the fact that so many people who are disempowered are also disinvested from the system, and that is a profound opportunity. But I'm not sure that we should think about how to organize them. I think they're already organizing.
Yeah.
And I just want to give a shout out
Organize with them.
Grace Gomez, if she's still here, who gave a really beautiful paper this afternoon about how people are, fierce mothers, are organizing all over the country, all of these amazing organizations that are, in a half dozen different states or more. And nobody in the audience, I don't think, was familiar with any of them. So I just want to remind everybody that the socially dead are organizing, they are theorizing, and they are actually underlying the things we think we're thinking originally.
Right.
And that we really have to seek to pay tribute, I think, to the people who set the conditions of possibility for our intellectual work and our activism where we see openings.
If I said that we should organize, well, I certainly didn't say that. What I meant to say is that we need to find out what they're up to and learn how to listen and find them and seek them, and then find the commonality. So, but I think you're right. There's probably no accident that we don't know, including me, about what's going on, because we're probably looking in the wrong direction or looking for things that are not actually the ways that these associations are being made. But two more things quick. Listen to you raise a lot of questions. Well, one is, yes, I'm finishing up a book on drifters, and I hope there's more to it than this, but I would say one of the themes is that to be cut adrift is to suffer mightily, but also be granted a kind of hard-earned freedom, a kind of painful disaffiliation that then makes you possibly a revolutionary. So you're absolutely, that's the dialectic of this too. But the last thing I want to say is this isn't false humility or anything. Please give me all the citations you have, because I want to learn more about this. I'm in the middle of thinking through, so please write those down or send them to me. Thank you. Hang on just a second. Yes.
In an odd sort of way, and this is kind of really scary to even think about it, the Donald Trump supporters is some way they're organized dead. Because their voices have been heard, their voices have been silenced for so long that they're now lashing out.
Right.
So that's an example of the organized dead that you were talking about.
Yeah, good point. And maybe even the perception of death that we might not agree that a white working class male has been aggrieved, and yet in his own life world he feels increasingly excluded. So yeah, that's a good point. So social death isn't necessarily even an observable phenomenon. It's as much a perceptual contest between different people as to sort of who can claim that mantle or who perceives themselves as caught up in that. Yeah, it's dangerous stuff, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Made me think of another possibility of interstitiality coming maybe out of Goffman, and that there are parts of ourselves that we can't accept. It's kind of turning Durkheim on his head about mechanical solidarity.
Right. Yeah.
That when we cast others apart, it's because we don't want to acknowledge our own vulnerability.
Yeah.
And that keeps us from identifying with the people we study rather than trying to separate from ourselves.
Great point. Yeah. And that perhaps part of what we once thought was who we were was the privilege of certain kinds of psychostability, that are now also being drawn, right? The circumstances about which you'd be able to even come close to a unified self, I think are more and more available only to a few. So what does even the self mean in a world that's constantly in flux and on the margins? As you say, are we the phenomenon too, as we live it? I'm sorry, I've been looking over here. Were there hands over here? I forgot to look over there. Anyone over here?
Well, just Mike gave a talk yesterday about civil exclusion, and we were talking about Catherine Beckett and Stephen Hurd's book Vanished, about the active production of this marginality and exclusion. So that literature goes back a little bit of a way.
That's really part of where I started thinking about this, was that spatially, more and more of the city is off limits to more and more people. And someone gave a wonderful thing about the little micro parks. that are being planted precisely to expand exclusion of sex offenders?
Right.
Oh, there's the film, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely, that's one of the, both hanging out with drifters, but also reading that literature is like, well, this is more, it is spatial, but maybe it's operating on all sorts of levels at once, and so we gotta quit looking for, we have to look for what's not there, right?
And then just maybe to piggyback a little bit on what Nicole said, in Ta-Nehisi Coates' memoir, there's a lot of talk about erasure.
Yeah.
And that's so central to the African-American experience, you know,
Yeah.
that the economic, the erasure of their economic role, the erasure of their cultural
Yeah.
contributions and all of that, so. That
And again, how then do you live in the face of that?
Yeah.
And what art
The
comes from that?
strategy.
What strategy, yeah. Yes?
Hi, so I've been sitting here like taking notes, debating on if I wanted to ask you this or not. So just first, my own personal lens, I look at dark tourism and haunted prisons, people who do ghost hunting.
Yeah.
And so as I'm listening to this, I was starting to think there might be kind of a problem, at least in my framing, when talking about ghosts and then excavating absence, because it's assuming absence. And my problem with that is when people believe in ghosts, when we talk about ghosts, it's not something that's absent, it's something that's there. It's something that we interpret through methods of power. And it's a continued presence that's not supposed to be there.
Right.
And that makes it monstrous and something to be feared.
Right. Out of
And
place.
so, yeah, so I didn't know if excavating absence was the best way, and I might have misunderstood, to really think about that, because it's not absence, it's more shunned, and it's
Right.
more intentional?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay.
And this is an honest question back to you, not a rebuttal, but if someone says, I want to go on a ghost tour, and I swear in this prison I can still feel the lies of all the men who spent the gallows, it's still there, they're arguing, but I think what's still there is the fact that they're not physically present, so they are in some ways, in different language, perhaps talking about the presence of what's now absent.
Absent. So it's like absent body, but
Right,
current
right.
person?
Yeah, or
And so-
current spirit, or
Yeah.
current hauntedness or something.
Yeah.
But you're right, it needs some teasing out. Who decides what's absent, what's present? And is that a social factor to some degree, or is that an economic factor? Is that also a perceptual contest between different people? The other,
Stimulated a lot of thinking about issues here. So you talk about the end of method. You were very critical of traditional positivist methods, which I think everybody is here, except we all use those methods in different ways. So I wonder whether we need to talk about expanding the different ways of using methods, think about new imaginative ways of doing research and so on. But why does that mean that we have to rule out the survey, statistical analysis? I mean, I'm thinking about incredibly important research coming out now about the relationship between social inequality and health issues. My brother's a quantitative sociologist, he does a lot of that kind of work, and where they're showing relationships between suicide, premature death, infant mortality, and large-scale economic issues. I find that kind of research very traditional, but also very useful in terms of framing things. And also, while I of course agree that we need to get away from that old Marxist distinction between superstructure and infrastructure, or between economic on top and cultural on below, we move far beyond that. But at the same time, what about what we used to call the political economy of power, studying that and how that operates?
Sure.
Is that something that's part of your imagination here?
yeah, and not to speak for Marx, but I think Marx, right, would be the first to say that it has to be historically situated, right? Our analysis has to be a critique of the current conditions as well as the knowledge of where they came from. So in that sense, yeah, not to abandon that form of analysis, but I was really trying to suggest that perhaps some of the old models of capitalist power from 1860, quite obviously, would not apply to late capitalism or whatever area we want to be in. So yeah, but I would say, and I'll decline to talk too much right now because it's a whole other debate. But yes, I am a militant anti-positivist. I would argue strongly on epistemic grounds, if no others, that quantitative analysis of human beings is inherently dehumanizing, and mistakes lived reality and the construction of meaning for something that's actually countable. Now, if someone does that as well as they can and uses that for progressive political ends, to me that's a very admirable strategy. I just wouldn't want to confuse that with a thoroughgoing account of the problem. So I would not dismiss your brother's work as good politics. I might dismiss it as bad epistemology.
So to all the young scholars here who are doing research like this, you're saying stop doing that and go in a different direction?
If they're doing quantitative research?
Yeah.
Yes, I would say that. I wouldn't suggest everybody else should say that. Yes, I would say that. That's my understanding.
But going off of that, I think one of the new things that I heard you say, which I think is really important for us to talk about, is actually also troubling what often gets framed as the counter to positivism, which is ethnography.
Absolutely.
And to recognize that ethnography, at least in the context of criminology and maybe sociology also, is also deeply disciplined in the way
that's
it's
exactly my
taught
point,
to see the
precisely.
sort of empirical moment and to see it ahistorically.
Yeah.
And so I can't speak for other people's graduate school experiences, but I was not taught archival methods. We didn't read much of any history. I read Child Savers in my own time. You know, like, and it's only in being out of what at the time was actually considered a critical criminal justice department that I've begun to recognize the importance of doing what you're suggesting we do, which is questioning the empirical and thinking about how it's historically produced and the conditions of its possibility and the way we see it and all the things.
The stuff I'm writing right now, I'm going to make the argument that ethnography was never actually a formalized technique. It was made that way post facto for certain political reasons, but in fact, if you go back to the early history of ethnography and anthropology and sociology, it actually always was much more fluid and flexible and intuitive, and then was imagined to be something else. But even if that's wrong, whatever with that, yeah, I think we absolutely cannot reify ethnography as this thing that's not positivism. It's not this thing. It has to be new terms of engagement with a world that I think I'm largely misunderstanding, despite 30 years of training as an ethnographer, if I try to look at it through that old lens. So yeah, we've got to be as self-critical methodologically as we are critical of other things. Yeah. But again, it's not false humility. I don't know. I'm not sure that I'm trying to take photos these days of things that aren't happening. I'm not sure I'm doing that well. You know, I'm trying to observe what's not there. Well, is that ethnography? To observe what's not? I don't know. Any other comments?
I have one comment.
Yes.
I like your imaginative, courageous position. I like it, but at the same time I have reservation because there must be struggle for knowledge democracy.
Sure.
So there should be imaginative, very courageous position that would force people to rethink what they have been doing.
Yeah.
At the same time also, it's very problematic to totally reject what we have usually called, for example, the protocol economic approach, critical approach. So it's very good to put everything on the table, compare and contrast, and the critically integrate them rather than...
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm an anarchist, so the last thing I'm doing is say what you should do. I'm trying to provoke discussion. Exactly. Right. Don't take any of it too seriously. Or maybe it is. Maybe it is. We're ready for the next phase. Professor Janelle, come up here, please. Professor Quintanilla from Eastern Kentucky University has decided that he's beginning his journey away from academia. And so we thought this would be the perfect occasion with friends and colleagues and fellow critical criminologists to honor him. And so if you will bear with me for just a second, we have a proclamation on his behalf. I'll turn it upside down. So this is a resolution, I'm sorry. Whereas Professor Kenneth Tennell, a.k.a. Grandpa, has provided exceptional academic service and scholarly leadership to Eastern Kentucky University for over 30 years. And whereas Professor Tennell has taught and inspired thousands of students through his compelling and provocative university courses in areas such as critical theory, cultural criminology, and rural crime. And whereas Professor Tennell has contributed to and advanced the tradition of critical criminology through the publication of dozens of journal articles and book chapters, and through such books as Pissing on Demand, Choosing Crime, Living Off Crime, and Once Upon a Place, The Fading of Community in Rural Kentucky. And whereas Professor Tennell has done more than any scholar of his generation to advance the criminology of American country music and roots music through his writing on motor ballads, prisons, and Johnny Cash. And whereas Professor Tennell as guitar player and lead singer of the Ron Akers Bluegrass Band, and as Lewis of Lewis and the Clark Tones, has entertained countless colleagues and students and has raised thousands of dollars for the Minority Scholarship Fund of the American Society of Criminology. And whereas Professor Tennell has remained an abiding friend of the poor and fighter for the beaten down, and a dedicated mentor to many a graduate student, thereby confirming the critical sociological and criminological ideal of living for these perspectives, not from them. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the New Directions in Critical Criminology Conference, along with his innumerable friends and colleagues, recognize Professor Ken Tennell for his outstanding scholarly and teaching career and for his unwavering dedication to social justice.
Wow.
Sing a song.
I think Michelle earlier mentioned something about refuge, and whenever I think about my career, the first place I always think of is UT's Sociology department gave me refuge a long time ago, way back starting in 1984, and I'm always thanking UT, whenever I do anything, I always thank UT for giving me a great education. I had some of the greatest teachers and mentors, and I've tried to follow the guidance that they gave me and follow in their footsteps. I never imagined I'd be doing this right here, but actually, the refuge was not right here. Across the street on 9th floor. Yeah, exactly. Only a handful of people probably know that I was a social worker when I graduated as an undergraduate, and never really imagined I would go to graduate school, but there's nothing like doing social work to drive you like that. And I'm very glad that I did. I'm very grateful to the Department of Sociology and UT. I'll have to say that my very first conference was in 1984. It was at the American Society of Criminology in the lovely city of Cincinnati. But I met some like-minded people right there at that conference, people in critical criminology, and they welcomed me and made me feel at home. And I found myself a member of this thriving community. And I look around, I see a lot of young people, a lot of graduate students, assistant professors, and critical criminology is a very welcoming environment. It's a great community to be a part of. And I hope that you'll continue it and keep it vibrant, keep it healthy, and I'm not going away. I'll be around. I'll come to meetings occasionally, so I hope to see you all there. And my God, thank you very much. This is incredible.
All right, we've got about 10 minutes or so. There's still sandwiches.